for people like Valentine, perceived as the solution to the fragmentation of the human persona imposed by Christianity. To know God, be an ethereal being, and renounce sexuality. Look at Peter Brown's books on the body and society, and you'll see how, really uniquely amongst the major world religions, Christianity has launched a war on the flesh and has associated eros with the demonic. Adam sinned, there is original sin, reproduction becomes necessary because we are now mortal. So if you're virginal, as the Church Fathers recognized, and to this day it's really part of the Vatican's teaching on sexuality, look at Lucien Legrand's book, The Biblical Doctrine of Virginity, to anticipate the life of the blessed, which of course is non-sexual, and to recover the paradisal state of innocence of Adam and Eve, you have to be asexual. That is axiomatic for them, certainly axiomatic in pre-conciliar 19th century French Catholicism. That's what she's reacting against. And if we look at the larger historical picture, we can see that this is what Islam is reacting against as well. When we want to start generalizing about Islam's understanding of sexuality, we have to see it in its original context of a polemic. Islam as a prophetic, as she would see it, revolutionary moment in history, is a polemic against the Christian war on the body. And the most common theme in Christian polemic against Islam until very recently was that Islam valorizes sexuality and therefore can't be legitimate. And even, horror of horrors, it seems to have some erotic component in its idea of paradise, which for people like Aquinas, Peter the Venerable, the medieval Christian writers on Islam, automatically disqualified it. If there's going to be sex in heaven, then that's a silly religion. Islam seems to come as an argument against that, and I think it's helpful to understand its temper and its take on sexuality when you recognize that original polemical motif. It is coming at a particular point in monotheistic history where Judaism has been, at least demographically, outstripped by the New Covenant, by Christianity, whose absolute focus is on renouncing and mortifying the flesh, separating out body from spirit. Liberate yourself from the cage of the body, and then you'll be truly yourself. Hence the monastic and priestly traditions. So we can say as our first cautious generalization that Islam's take on sexuality, and gender sexuality you can never speak about in isolation from each other, is part of a polemic against Christianity, and particularly against the characteristic recurrent Christian war on the flesh. Now, this is part of a larger 19th century, early 20th century European romantic sense of the South, the sunlit lands, the exotic East, as the place where there is sexual plenitude and human wholeness. And, well, you think of Gide going to Biskra and Flaubert going to Upper Egypt and all kinds of odd people going to Tangiers. That's where you wanted to go if you were the anticipation of what in the 60s would be called the beatniks. Oscar Wilde goes to Algiers. It's not just a heterosexual alternative. And there are moments in European Enlightenment literature where that actually comes to the surface, and where Islam and the prophet of Islam are platformed as ideals which should be aspired to as the alternative to the mechanistic narrative of a still anti-sexual or sexually chaotic, unregulated Europe. Goethe is the best known example, but others could be cited. Rilke would be an example with his poems on the prophet, and various others. I brought along a translation of Goethe's Mahomedsgesang. Schubert turned it into 2 songs. This is 1770 something. Let all come then, and now swells he lordlier still, yea, e'en a people bears his regal flood on high, and in triumph onward rolling names to countries gives he, cities spring to light beneath his foot, Ever on he rushes, leaves the tower's flame-tipped summit, marble palaces, the offspring of his fullness far behind. Cedar houses bears the Atlas on his giant shoulders, fluttering in the breeze far, far above him, 1,000 flags are gaily floating, bearing witness to his might. And so beareth he his brethren, all his treasures, all his children, wildly shouting to the bosom of his long-expectant father. Well, a lot of Muslims would say that sounds very weird as a kind of na'at, but that's Goethe's Mahomedsgesang. That's the 18th century dawning of a realization that perhaps in the East there's an alternative to this industrialized but sexually puritanical culture that seems to be producing a stressful and an inauthentic human persona. Valentine is an extension of that. And as I mentioned, other examples. You could look perhaps at some of the paintings of Matisse, for instance. The window in Tangiers and the plump naked ladies. There's a kind of connection between the two. Now, that's the context. Two alternatives. Islam and Christianity obviously cognate religions, overlapping religions in many respects. But on this fundamental issue, sexuality, and therefore the take on gender, there's going to be a very substantial difference. And I already mentioned how the favorite polemic for medieval European priests arguing against Islam was that it was the religion of sexual indulgence. That's why they thought that Muslims worship on Friday, because it was the pagan day of Venus. So why else would it be the Muslim Yom al-Jumu'ah, the day of Friday? A recurrent polemic. If we take that theologically and look at the Quran as Muslims as a divine rectification of a religious story that has gone tragically wrong, that is, through this fragmentation of body and soul, causing immense human suffering and spiritual inauthenticity, we are going to expect to find in this story a valorization of eros. And you can say it's already there. It's in Judaism, which valorizes sexuality just as much as Islam does, and that's one of the few things that you're not just allowed to do, but supposed to do on the Sabbath if you're a rabbinical Jew. That's true. That's very true. And in fact, you could point out that in most traditional religions, there is a generally positive attitude to eros. And even in some traditions, particularly in the subcontinent, a tradition of using erotic metaphors as a metaphor for the union with the divine. It's only in Christianity, classical Christianity, that's very unusual. But nonetheless, that's one of the themes of the Quran, and that, I think, is one of the explanations for the Quran's explicit and repeated eroticization of paradise, which, of course, feeds into the rich mystical tradition. If the purpose of the Sufi is to live in his life a life of perfection, then the life of the blessed in paradise must be a kind of sign of what that perception would be like, which is the exact reciprocal of the Christian idea. The life of the blessed in paradise is virginal, therefore we should be virginal. No marriage, no giving in marriage in heaven, says St. Paul, therefore that's the ideal. That's the saved state. For Muslims, because eros is paradisal, and paradise is seen as the kind of pure area of archetypes of the things that exist only imperfectly in this world, therefore part of the devotional life is going to be erotic in Islam. Of course, it's a huge, diverse, chaotic, unregulated civilization. There's no papacy to say what's right and what's wrong, and you will find celibates, just as you will find vegetarians, and just as you will find all kinds of eccentrics on the fringes of different Islamic movements. But by and large, a characteristic feature of Islamic spirituality, when compared to classical Christian spirituality, is that it's a bit disappointing if the saint is unmarried. Look at somebody like Ibn Ajiba, 200 years ago in Morocco, one of the greatest saints of North Africa, still a household name there. One of the processes of purgation which his teacher put him through was that he had to live next to the city's dunghills and that he had to beg in the streets in order to break his ego. If you read the biography, you'll find during that period he married 2 wives, which if you compare it to the lives of the saints in a Christian context, doesn't compute at all. But for the Muslim way of looking at things, that's not a problem, Because as Nawawi says, one of the great medieval Muslim jurists, all desires harden the heart with the exception of sexual desire which softens it.